July 21, 1944. Shortly after dawn, American warships opened fire on Guam. For weeks, the island had been under relentless bombardment. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft, and artillery had pounded Japanese positions across the island. Entire sections of the coastline had disappeared beneath smoke and fire. Yet despite everything, nearly 20,000 Japanese soldiers were still waiting. They had spent years preparing for this moment. Hidden inside caves, bunkers, and fortified jungle positions, they believed Guam could become one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. If they could stop the Americans here, they might delay the advance toward Japan itself. They were wrong. What followed over the next 21 days became one of the most devastating military disasters suffered by Japanese forces during World War II. Defensive lines collapsed. Counterattacks were annihilated. Entire battalions disappeared from the battlefield. Thousands of soldiers were trapped with no possibility of reinforcement, evacuation, or retreat. By the time the battle ended, 18,337 Japanese troops were dead. An entire garrison had effectively been wiped out, but Guam was more than just another island. Japanese commanders knew that if Guam fell, American bombers would gain a direct path toward the Japanese homeland. Cities that had never seen enemy aircraft would suddenly be within reach. Factories, ports, and military bases across Japan would become targets. The loss of Guam was not simply a battlefield defeat. It was the beginning of a new phase of the war, one that would eventually bring American bombers directly over Japan. This is Guam, 1944, one of the deadliest disasters ever suffered by the Japanese Army in the Pacific. By early 1944, Japanese commanders knew Guam would eventually be attacked. The American advance across the Pacific was accelerating. One island after another had fallen, and the Mariana Islands were rapidly becoming the next major objective. For Tokyo, the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. If Guam fell, the consequences would reach far beyond the island itself. American planners were already preparing to deploy the new B-29 Superfortress bomber. Unlike previous aircraft, the B-29 possessed the range necessary to strike targets deep inside Japan. Factories, naval bases, industrial centers, and eventually entire cities would become vulnerable to attack. For the first time in the war, the Japanese homeland was in danger of coming within direct reach of American air power. Japanese military leaders understood exactly what that meant. As a result, Guam was transformed into a fortress. Nearly 20,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were assigned to defend the island. Lieutenant General Takeshi Takashina oversaw the construction of extensive defensive networks stretching across beaches, hills, cliffs, and jungle-covered valleys. Artillery positions were hidden inside caves. Machine gun nests were concealed among thick vegetation. Ammunition depots were buried underground. Defensive strongpoints were linked through tunnels and natural cave systems that offered protection from air attacks. Years of preparation went into the island's defenses. Japanese commanders believed Guam could become another battlefield where American forces would suffer enormous casualties. Rather than trying to stop the invasion directly on the beaches, they planned to draw American troops inland before launching powerful counterattacks from prepared positions. The strategy reflected lessons learned throughout the Pacific War. American naval power was now too strong to defeat at sea. Japanese commanders therefore hoped terrain could compensate for their growing disadvantages. The island's dense jungle, rugged hills, and extensive cave systems would become weapons of their own. If everything went according to plan, the Americans would become trapped in a costly battle of attrition. But while Japanese forces strengthened Guam, the United States was preparing something far larger. The recent capture of Saipan had opened the door to the Mariana Islands. American commanders now intended to secure Guam and Tinian, completing their control of the region. Once those islands were captured, construction crews could begin building massive airfields, capable of supporting long-range bombing operations against Japan itself. For Admiral Chester Nimitz and American planners, Guam was not simply another island on the map. It was a future base for the air offensive that would eventually reach the Japanese homeland. As preparations for the invasion accelerated, one question remained. Could Guam survive the overwhelming firepower that would precede the landing? The answer began to emerge weeks before American troops ever reached the beaches. Warships gathered offshore in growing numbers. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, escort carriers, and fleet carriers assembled around the island. American aircraft appeared overhead almost daily. Bombs struck coastal defenses. Naval guns hammered suspected artillery positions. Observation aircraft directed fire onto cave entrances and fortified strongpoints. The bombardment continued day after day. Entire sections of Guam's defensive network were destroyed before the battle even began. Supply dumps exploded. Communication lines were severed. Defensive positions disappeared beneath landslides and rubble. Soldiers who had spent years preparing for the invasion watched helplessly as many of their strongest fortifications were systematically dismantled. Yet, despite the destruction, Japanese commanders remained convinced that the decisive battle had not yet started. They believed the Americans would pay heavily once they came ashore. What they did not realize was that the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted far more dramatically than anyone in Tokyo wanted to admit. By July 1944, the United States possessed overwhelming superiority in ships, aircraft, artillery, logistics, and manpower. Guam was about to become another demonstration of that reality. On the morning of July 21, 1944, after weeks of relentless bombardment, American forces finally began landing on the island. The battle Japan had spent years preparing for had arrived. Quick note before we continue. Every story on this channel takes hours of research, writing, and editing to put together. If you're enjoying the video, consider subscribing. It helps support the channel and allows me to keep making stories like this one. Now let's get back to Guam. On the morning of July 21, 1944, the invasion finally began. As dawn broke over Guam, American warships once again opened fire. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed another barrage against the island's beaches, while aircraft roared overhead, searching for surviving Japanese positions. The bombardment had already lasted for weeks, but American commanders wanted every possible advantage before sending thousands of men ashore. Then the landing craft moved forward. Waves of U.S. Marines and Army troops headed toward the western coast of Guam, targeting beaches near Asan and Agat. For many of the men packed into the landing craft, visibility was poor. Smoke from naval bombardment drifted across the shoreline, obscuring much of what waited ahead. Japanese defenders remained hidden. Takashina's strategy had never depended on stopping the invasion at the water's edge. Instead, many defensive positions were located farther inland, where artillery, machine guns, and mortars could strike once American forces became concentrated on the beaches. As the first landing craft approached shore, scattered Japanese fire began to appear. Machine gun bursts swept sections of the beach. Mortar rounds exploded among advancing troops. Snipers hidden in caves and jungle positions opened fire whenever targets appeared. Despite the resistance, the Americans continued pushing inland. Years of combat across the Pacific had transformed amphibious warfare into a highly organized operation. Engineers cleared obstacles. Tanks rolled ashore behind the infantry. Naval gunfire remained available to support units encountering heavy resistance. Whenever Japanese strongpoints revealed their positions, artillery and aircraft were quickly directed against them. By midday, thousands of American troops had established footholds on Guam. The fighting, however, was far from over. Japanese artillery continued striking landing zones. Hidden cave systems allowed defenders to survive bombardments and reappear unexpectedly. Small groups of soldiers launched local counterattacks throughout the day, attempting to slow the American advance before larger formations could organize. Meanwhile, Takashina faced a difficult decision. Every hour that passed allowed additional American troops, tanks, ammunition, and supplies to reach the island. If the invasion force became too large, Japan's chances of driving it back would disappear. The Japanese commander therefore prepared for the action he believed could still change the battle, a massive counterattack. As darkness approached, thousands of Japanese soldiers began moving toward American positions. The plan was ambitious. Rather than remaining inside defensive positions and slowly surrendering territory, Japanese forces would strike the invasion beaches with overwhelming force during the night. If enough American units could be thrown back into the sea, the invasion might still be defeated. For many Japanese soldiers, the coming attack represented more than a military operation. It was a final opportunity. Most understood that reinforcements would never arrive. American naval superiority made evacuation impossible. There was no realistic path off the island. Victory meant destroying the invasion force. Defeat meant death. Shortly before midnight, the attack began. Thousands of Japanese troops emerged from jungle cover and charged American lines. Officers led assaults with swords drawn. Soldiers armed with rifles, machine guns, grenades, and bayonets rushed forward in wave after wave. In some sectors, the fighting became so close that opposing troops could barely distinguish friend from foe in the darkness. For a brief period, confusion spread across parts of the American beachhead. But the Japanese attackers soon encountered a problem that had become increasingly common throughout the Pacific War: American firepower. Machine guns opened up across the defensive line. Mortars dropped shells into advancing formations. Artillery batteries fired continuously. Naval gunfire was called in against concentrations of Japanese troops. Tanks joined the battle wherever terrain allowed movement. The result was devastating. Entire assault groups were torn apart before reaching American positions. Others managed to penetrate sections of the line only to become isolated and destroyed. Bodies accumulated across fields, roads, and jungle clearings as wave after wave collapsed under concentrated fire. By dawn, the counterattack had failed. Thousands of Japanese soldiers had been killed or wounded. The Americans remained firmly ashore, and with every failed attack, Guam moved one step closer to becoming the disaster Japanese commanders had desperately hoped to avoid. If you're still watching, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if your family was connected to this battle, whether in an American uniform, a Japanese uniform, or as a Chamorro civilian, this story is part of your history. Let us know you're here. The failure of the night counterattack changed the battle. Japanese commanders had hoped a powerful assault against the beachheads would throw the Americans back into the sea before they could fully establish themselves on Guam. Instead, the attack had cost thousands of casualties while achieving almost nothing. The invasion force remained firmly ashore. Even worse, American reinforcements continued arriving every hour. More troops landed. More tanks rolled onto the beaches. Artillery batteries expanded their positions inland. Supplies accumulated faster than Japanese forces could disrupt them. What had begun as a vulnerable beachhead was rapidly transforming into a powerful offensive force. For Lieutenant General Takeshi Takashina, the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. His army had already suffered heavy losses during the bombardment and the failed counterattack. Many units were no longer operating at full strength. Communication between positions became more difficult each day as American artillery destroyed telephone lines and command posts. Yet, despite the growing crisis, Takashina still believed the battle could be prolonged. If Japanese forces could slow the American advance and force them into costly jungle fighting, Guam might still become the attritional battle Tokyo had envisioned. The problem was that American commanders were learning quickly. Instead of launching reckless frontal assaults against every Japanese position, Marines and Army units increasingly relied on overwhelming firepower. Whenever defenders were discovered, artillery, tanks, flamethrowers, naval gunfire, and aircraft were brought forward to destroy them before infantry advanced. One by one, Japanese strongpoints disappeared. Caves that had survived weeks of bombardment were sealed with explosives. Hidden machine gun nests were eliminated by tanks firing at point-blank range. Artillery positions that revealed themselves were quickly targeted by American aircraft circling overhead. The Japanese defenders were fighting hard, but they were fighting a battle they could not replace. Every soldier killed was gone forever. Every artillery piece destroyed could not be replaced. Every ammunition stockpile consumed brought the garrison closer to collapse. As American forces pushed inland from both the Asan and Agate beachheads, the situation became even more dangerous for the defenders. The two landing zones were slowly beginning to connect. If that happened, the Americans would control a large section of western Guam and gain freedom to launch major operations deeper into the island. Japanese commanders attempted to delay this outcome through a series of defensive actions across difficult terrain. Jungle-covered ridges became battlefields. Hilltops changed hands repeatedly. Small groups of soldiers fought from cave systems long after surrounding positions had fallen. In some areas, Japanese troops refused to surrender even when completely isolated. American soldiers frequently discovered defenders hiding in caves days after nearby fighting had ended. Others launched sudden attacks against patrols before disappearing back into the jungle. The resistance remained fierce, but it was no longer coordinated. As losses mounted, Japanese units increasingly became isolated from one another. Officers struggled to maintain control. Communication between sectors broke down. The island's defensive network, carefully constructed over several years, was slowly being dismantled piece by piece. Then came another major blow. On July 25th, only 4 days after the invasion began, Lieutenant General Takashina was seriously wounded during fighting near the front lines. The injury created immediate problems for Japanese command. At a moment when the battle required coordination and leadership, the commander responsible for Guam's defense could no longer effectively direct operations. Japanese efforts became increasingly fragmented as American pressure continued growing. The loss of leadership reflected a larger reality unfolding across the island. The battle was no longer about whether Guam could be saved. It was becoming a question of how long the defenders could continue fighting. American forces now possessed momentum, superior numbers, overwhelming firepower, and secure supply lines. The Japanese had caves, determination, and shrinking reserves. Every day the balance shifted further against them. And soon one of the strongest defensive positions on the island would become the scene of another devastating defeat that pushed Guam even closer to disaster. As the Americans pushed deeper into Guam, the battle increasingly revolved around one objective: the high ground. Whoever controlled the hills and ridges overlooking the island controlled the battle itself. Observation posts placed on elevated terrain could direct artillery fire, monitor troop movements, and dominate surrounding areas. Japanese commanders understood this long before the invasion began, which is why many of their strongest defensive positions had been built in the island's rugged interior. Now those positions were under direct threat. American forces advanced steadily northward, clearing one defensive line after another. Progress was often measured in yards rather than miles. Every ridge concealed machine guns. Every cave could hide an entire squad. Every patch of jungle might contain snipers waiting for an opportunity to strike. The terrain worked in Japan's favor. The Americans compensated with firepower. Whenever resistance was encountered, artillery batteries opened fire. Tanks were brought forward wherever possible. Aircraft attacked cave entrances and suspected defensive positions. Engineers used explosives to destroy bunkers that infantry could not safely approach. The process was slow, methodical, and devastating. One Japanese position after another disappeared beneath concentrated fire. For the defenders, conditions became increasingly desperate. Food supplies were shrinking, medical facilities were overwhelmed, ammunition stocks were being consumed faster than they could be redistributed. Entire units that had begun the battle at full strength were now reduced to fractions of their original numbers. Yet surrender remained almost unthinkable. Japanese military culture emphasized resistance to the end. Officers continued organizing defensive actions even when success was clearly impossible. Many soldiers believed death in battle was preferable to capture. As a result, fighting often continued long after tactical defeat was obvious. American troops repeatedly encountered isolated groups defending positions that no longer had any strategic value. Some soldiers remained inside caves until they were killed. Others launched suicidal attacks rather than retreat. The battle became increasingly brutal. By late July, American forces had succeeded in linking their beachheads and expanding control across western Guam. This achievement transformed the entire campaign. The invasion force was no longer fighting to survive. It was preparing to destroy the remaining Japanese defenses. For the defenders, the consequences were severe. Positions that once formed part of an organized defensive network were now isolated pockets surrounded by advancing American forces. Communication between units became almost impossible. Orders often failed to reach frontline troops. In many areas, commanders no longer knew the exact location or condition of neighboring units. The island's defense was beginning to fragment. Then came another devastating blow. Lieutenant General Takeshi Takashina, already wounded during earlier fighting, could no longer effectively direct operations. Japanese command passed to Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata, who inherited a rapidly deteriorating situation. Obata immediately recognized the reality facing the garrison. The Americans possessed overwhelming superiority. Naval gunfire remained available at any time. Aircraft dominated the skies. Fresh troops continued arriving. Meanwhile, Japanese losses mounted every day. Still, there was no possibility of evacuation. No relief force was coming. No fleet would arrive to save Guam. The garrison was effectively alone. As American troops captured key ridges and observation points, artillery fire became even more accurate. Japanese movement during daylight became extremely dangerous. Supply parties were frequently intercepted. Reinforcements attempting to reach frontline positions often suffered heavy casualties before arriving. The battle was entering its final phase. The Japanese army on Guam had not yet been destroyed, but it was being pushed steadily toward the northern end of the island, where thousands of exhausted soldiers would soon face a decision: continue fighting or die trying. And for most of them, there would be little difference between the two. By the beginning of August 1944, the outcome of the battle was no longer in doubt. The question was not whether Japan would lose Guam. The question was how many more men would die before the fighting finally ended. Across the island, surviving Japanese units were falling back toward the north. What had once been a coordinated defensive force had become a collection of isolated groups, many operating without reliable communication, accurate intelligence, or clear orders. Entire companies had disappeared. Some battalions existed only on paper. Officers often commanded whatever soldiers happened to remain nearby. Yet despite the collapse, resistance continued. Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata understood that Guam could not be saved. American troops controlled most of the island. The beaches were secure. Supply routes functioned without interruption. Artillery and air power dominated every major battlefield. Still, surrender was never seriously considered. Like many Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific War, Obata viewed continued resistance as both a military obligation and a matter of personal honor. If Guam was to be lost, it would be lost only after every possible effort had been made to continue the fight. As American forces advanced northward, they encountered increasingly desperate opposition. Japanese soldiers established defensive positions inside caves, ravines, and heavily forested terrain. Small groups launched ambushes against patrols before disappearing into the jungle. Snipers targeted supply routes. Night attacks continued despite their increasingly disastrous results. The fighting became less organized but no less dangerous. American troops could clear an area during the day only to face attacks after nightfall. Caves believed to be abandoned suddenly erupted with gunfire. Isolated defenders remained hidden for days, sometimes weeks, refusing to surrender even when completely surrounded. But every engagement produced the same result: more Japanese casualties. American superiority in firepower was simply overwhelming. Whenever resistance was discovered, artillery was called forward. Tanks blasted cave entrances. Engineers used explosives and flamethrowers to eliminate fortified positions. Aircraft attacked targets beyond the reach of ground forces. Japanese defenders were steadily being compressed into smaller and smaller pockets. Food shortages became severe. Water became difficult to obtain in many areas. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Thousands of wounded soldiers had little chance of receiving proper treatment. For many defenders, survival itself was becoming impossible. Yet even under these conditions, some officers continued planning counterattacks. The belief that a final blow might somehow disrupt the American advance never completely disappeared. Small assaults continued throughout the northern sector of the island. Most ended exactly as earlier attacks had ended, with devastating losses. By now, however, the scale of destruction was impossible to ignore. The Japanese army on Guam was no longer fighting for victory, it was fighting for existence. Every day brought new casualties, every day reduced the number of surviving defenders, every day pushed the garrison closer to complete destruction. By early August, entire sections of northern Guam had become graveyards. The battle that Japanese commanders had hoped would stop the American advance had become one of the most catastrophic defeats suffered by Japanese ground forces anywhere in the Pacific. And for General Obata and the remaining defenders, the final chapter was rapidly approaching. On August 10, 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Guam officially came to an end. The battle had lasted just 21 days. For the Japanese garrison, it had been nothing short of a catastrophe. Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata understood the situation long before the final hours arrived. American forces controlled virtually the entire island. The remaining defenders had been pushed into isolated pockets across the northern mountains and jungle. Ammunition was running low. Food supplies had nearly vanished. Communication between surviving units had largely collapsed. There would be no rescue, no reinforcements, no evacuation. The battle was over. Yet even then, many Japanese soldiers continued fighting. Small groups remained hidden inside caves and ravines. Others attempted to break through American lines in desperate efforts to avoid capture. Some officers gathered surviving troops for final attacks despite knowing they had almost no chance of success. The result was predictable: more casualties, more deaths, more isolated groups disappearing into the jungle never to return. As American troops swept through the remaining defensive areas, they encountered scenes that revealed the true scale of the disaster. Entire positions had been obliterated by artillery fire. Collapsed cave systems contained the bodies of soldiers trapped inside during bombardments. Destroyed command posts showed how completely Japanese leadership structures had been dismantled during the battle. In many areas, defenders had simply fought until they could no longer continue. Some had died beside their weapons, others had been killed while attempting to launch final counterattacks. Many had never received orders to retreat because communication had already broken down. The numbers told the story. By the end of the battle, approximately 18,337 Japanese soldiers had been killed. Only a few thousand were taken prisoner. For comparison, the United States suffered roughly 7,000 casualties, including both killed and wounded. The disparity reflected a reality that had become increasingly common by 1944. Japanese forces could still fight with extraordinary determination, but they could no longer match American firepower, logistics, naval power, or industrial strength. Guam demonstrated that imbalance with brutal clarity. What made the defeat even more significant was the quality of the troops lost. Many of the men killed on Guam had spent years preparing the island's defenses. They represented valuable manpower that Japan could no longer replace. By mid-1944, the Japanese military was already struggling to recover from losses suffered across the Pacific. The destruction of an entire garrison only deepened the problem. For American commanders, the victory carried enormous strategic value. The island was secured. Construction crews immediately began expanding airfields. Harbors were developed. Supply facilities were established. Within months, Guam would become one of the most important American bases in the Pacific. The island that Japan had spent years fortifying was now serving the enemy. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the battle was that it did not truly end on August 10th. Not for everyone. Hidden in the jungles and caves of Guam, small groups of Japanese soldiers remained behind. Some had become separated from their units. Others refused to believe the battle was over. A few simply chose never to surrender. For years after the fighting ended, isolated holdouts would continue hiding across the island. and one of them would become famous around the world for continuing the war long after Japan itself had surrendered. The Battle of Guam ended in August 1944. For the men who fought there, the campaign was over. For Japan, however, the consequences were only beginning. The loss of Guam was not simply another defeat in a war already filled with setbacks. It represented the collapse of one of the most important defensive positions remaining in the Pacific. Together with Saipan and Tinian, Guam formed part of the Mariana Islands, territory that Japanese leaders had considered essential to the defense of the homeland. Now all three islands were in American hands. The impact was immediate. Within weeks, engineers, construction units, and logistical personnel began transforming Guam into a massive military base. Airfields expanded rapidly, roads were improved, supply depots appeared across the island. Harbors filled with ships carrying equipment, fuel, ammunition, and aircraft. What Japan had spent years fortifying, the United States converted into a launching point for the next phase of the war, and that next phase would be far more dangerous for Japan than anything that had come before. For the first time, American B-29 bombers could operate from secure bases in the Mariana Islands. The significance of this development cannot be overstated. Until 1944, Japan's homeland had remained largely beyond the reach of sustained American bombing operations. Now that protection was disappearing. Factories that produced aircraft and weapons were vulnerable. Military installations became targets. Industrial centers that supported the war effort could now be attacked repeatedly. American bombers no longer needed to fight their way across thousands of miles of ocean before reaching Japan. They were already there. In many ways, the road to the strategic bombing campaign against Japan passed directly through Guam. The island became one of the largest American bases in the Pacific. Thousands of aircraft operated from the Marianas. Supplies flowed through the island in enormous quantities. Guam evolved from a Japanese fortress into a critical component of the American war machine. For Tokyo, there was no way to reverse the loss. The Japanese Navy could no longer challenge American control of the region. The Army lacked the resources necessary to launch a counteroffensive. Every major defeat in 1944 made recovery increasingly impossible. Guam was gone forever. The human cost was equally staggering. More than 18,337 Japanese soldiers had been killed in just 21 days. Entire units ceased to exist. Years of preparation had ended in complete destruction. For many families in Japan, the battle simply became another list of names that never returned home. Yet even after organized resistance ended, traces of the battle remained. Small groups of Japanese soldiers continued hiding in Guam's jungles for years. Some avoided contact with local inhabitants. Others survived by stealing food or living off the land. A number refused to believe the war had ended. The most famous of these holdouts, Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi, would not emerge until 1972, nearly 3 decades after the battle. When discovered, he was still living in a hidden jungle shelter. For him, the war had never truly ended. His story became one of the final reminders of the determination and tragedy that characterized Japan's Pacific campaigns. Today, Guam is often overshadowed by larger battles such as Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Midway, or Leyte Gulf. But the island's importance should not be underestimated. The Battle of Guam destroyed an entire Japanese garrison, opened the door to direct attacks against the Japanese homeland, and helped shape the final year of the Pacific War. In just 21 days, Japan lost more than 18,000 men, and with them it lost one of its last opportunities to keep the war far from its own shores. Before you go, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what story you'd like to see next. Did your family serve on Guam? Did someone you know land on those beaches, fight in those jungles, or live through the occupation? We read every comment, and many future videos come directly from your suggestions. These stories belong to all of us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.